So, hello all. Thank you so much for attending this talk on a Sunday. I think that this conference in general is a really great collection of a lot of good topics, and I'm really impressed by a lot of the other speakers and the things that they have to offer. But I hope that with this talk, I can inspire you a little bit for studying networks, which is what I'm doing in my PhD right now. And I think what's really interesting about the field of network science, and something that a lot of people that are, developing tools and algorithms for network data sometimes forget is that a lot of the best problems and techniques actually come from domain-specific problems. And I think that we have a really powerful set of machinery that we can use to actually address a lot of domain-specific questions. And what I'd like to do in the rest of my career, hopefully, is actually get people to talk to each other more. So hopefully with some of the modeling techniques that I present, maybe you'll find application in your own work. And I chose to highlight some aspects of network science that I think are particularly useful for solving problems in fields like biology and social science, medicine, and things like this, which are some applications I'm most interested in. So I gave you some contact information at the end. So as always, please feel free to send me an email if you have further questions after this presentation. I really love talking to people and learning about what is interesting to them and how networks could be useful in their work. So I assume that if you're here, you might already know something about networks, but in case you're new, a network is basically just a data structure that encodes relational information through edges between a set of entities, so nodes. So in this picture here, the circles are the nodes and the edges connecting them encode their relationship. So in this picture, I have just a social network. So the nodes are people in the network, and there's an edge between them if they interact somehow on this platform. But of course, you can use this data structure for all kinds of applications. In a biological example, the nodes could be genes, and interactions or edges between them could signify that they are co-expressed or that they interact or something like this. And so it's really just a simple data structure that allows you to encode pairwise relationships between things and whatever you want that to be. So as I mentioned at the beginning, is that in our fields, there's this constant interplay between domain experts in computational fields, and the methods that we develop are often motivated or hopefully motivated. Some of the mathematicians might feel differently because actually networks has a lot of interesting math problems associated, which is something that I try to stay a little bit further away from. I prefer to be more on the computational side of things, but in particular, fields where networks are kind of well integrated in the analysis of their data are biology, neuroscience, social science, and marketing. So all of these things have lots of papers already in the literature that involve network data. Okay, so before we jump into the actual tools and computational techniques, I just want to show you a few cool applications. Okay, so this first one is a paper that just came out, like I think 2 weeks ago, and I saw this on Twitter actually, and I thought, wow, this would be a cool example to share. So what this paper is about is basically they analyze social networks. So again, the nodes are just people, and then you have edges connecting the people, and it's on one of these platforms that you could actually talk about what kind of exercise you're doing and communicate with other people about that. And so what they found is that people that are close in your social network have a high chance of influencing you and how successful you are at running in terms of how far you run and how fast you run. And if you think about this, it's kind of true. So for example, I live in North Carolina, and everybody here is super active because the weather's nice. And so you see that all of your friends are like going for a run after work. So it makes sense that if your friends are doing that, you're more likely to do that too. So the results here are kind of intuitive, but I think that how they set up their modeling problem in terms of defining these ego networks, which just basically means that you can consider different neighborhoods from a node that you start at. So ego of T would be all immediate friends of the node T, and then ego T plus 1 would be like second order neighbors. And you can see that the closer you are, so for example, the first ego has a highest social influence coefficient. So the moral of the story is, if you really want to be fit, you should find a lot of fit friends. Okay, the second application that I want to talk about is in information retrieval. So all of us are doing lots of Google searches every day. As we know, the internet is actually a huge network. So here the nodes are web pages, and the links between them exist if you can get from one web page to the other. But actually, in this particular example, this was about actually finding images that relate to some query of interest. And they actually use something called a centrality measure, which I don't think I'll talk much about here. But a centrality measure in a network just talks about how relevant a particular node is in that network. So if you could think about a high centrality person in a social network would be a person that has lots of connections, and more importantly than lots of connections to other nodes that have lots of connections. So what this paper did was actually use these centrality measures that they can compute on different nodes in order to give back something or an image that was most relevant in terms of what else it was related to in the network. So it's kind of cool. And actually, when you do a search on Google, they're using a technique called PageRank to rank the hits that come up. And that's essentially a centrality measure that a lot of other networks applications are also using. Okay, so then I have a biological example. And this is basically just showing how you can consider temporal networks of species interactions. So here, all of the nodes are different kinds of microbial species, and it's a temporal slice over time. So what they're doing is just modeling how these species are interacting over time. And then you could set up some kind of scientific question to look at how the structure of this network changes over time or under different conditions or things like this. Because you can see that in each year slice, the networks look a lot different. Okay, so from all of these examples, the problem that I really want to show you is important is that oftentimes in real life, your network looks like this blob, this giant thing that has no structure that we can't really understand a lot about. And a lot of us, we refer to this as hairballs because sometimes you'll see this in a paper and you'll think, well, I mean, I don't really know what to do with this information. So what I think is the most important thing to do with networks is to develop tools that allow us to distill these disgusting collections of information to actually glean information from it that can help us make conclusions or ask further questions or to understand a scientific question. And so the tools that I seek to develop actually try to break something like this up into structures that humans can understand, or not even humans, but also computers can understand automatically. Okay, so how is this done? So what we want to do is first unravel the large-scale structural patterns. So to do this, I'll talk about community detection and link prediction. And then we also want to model actually behaviors in the network. So this can be done through anomaly detection, which I'll talk about. Information spreading, so some people analyze how information can flow through a network in terms of how that's related to a structure, and node influence, which is related to that centrality problem that I mentioned before, where you're quantifying how influential a node is in the graph. So the star topics are, I think, things that are really neat, but unfortunately, I don't have that much time, so I'm going to just talk about community detection, link prediction, and anomaly detection. But feel free to ask me about the other topics if you want references. I can direct you to those at the end of the talk. So community detection is actually the field that I work on primarily, and it's really simple. So we see here that we have a really large network, and then we have regions of the graph, so like this blue region and the pink region, that are really highly interconnected groups of nodes. So they have a lot of within group edges, but they're sparsely connected to the rest of the network. And so what we aim to do with community detection is to actually start with our graph, which won't have any colors at the beginning, and then we'd like to partition nodes into groups such that nodes that are within a group have a really high number of edges and low edges to the rest of to other groups. But unfortunately, this is kind of a hard task. Like, it's not trivial because you think that you have to come up with a partition, and all of the nodes could go into different groups. So a lot of the work that's been done in this field has been how to develop computationally tractable, efficient ways to find communities and networks. And I'd like to emphasize that this is a clustering analog. So if you've ever done a cluster analysis on your data, you're essentially looking at data in a high dimensional space, and then you're assigning the data points to clusters based on where they're situated in some higher dimensional space. We're doing the exact same thing here. We're just trying to deal with edges and use that as kind of our feature vector. So if you can think about a community of nodes is essentially a cluster of points in a higher dimensional space. And so to give you another biological example of why we might be interested in finding communities, so oftentimes community structures and network can give insight on functional relationships. So if we have, for example, a gene network here, we can see that there's different communities of genes, so shown in these different boxes. And actually, these communities correspond to different biological functions. So the network is constructed based on some kind of experimental data or something like this. And then we also see that the communities that come out actually have functional roles. So I think that this is an important interpretation of communities, or how you might validate that what you find in a network is a good partition if what you get out actually aligns with the domain information that you already have. So there's a lot of ways to solve this optimization problem for community detection, but I'm going to tell you about just one way that you can do it. So one way is through defining a quality function where you're trying to find a partition of nodes into groups, and we're going to use the CI to denote the cluster member or the community assignment of node I. And what you do when you do this quality function optimization, and we call this particular one modularity, is you're trying to find a partition such that what you find is maximally different from a null model of a graph with no structure. So if you imagined just a network with edges dropped in randomly, or somewhat randomly, I'm not going to really go into the exact mechanics of the null model here, but if you imagine a graph that essentially has no real structure, we'd like to find a partition that is maximally different from that. And so the components of this modularity quality function are M, the number of edges, I and J is just going over all of the nodes, like all pairs of nodes, and that's encoded with an adjacency matrix. So this is a 1 if there is a link between I and J, and a 0 otherwise. But you can also have a weighted case where the ijth entry of this matrix A is actually the weight between I and J. And then Ki and Kj are the degrees or the sum of the links of that go from node I, and Kj is the sum of the links that go from node J. And then this delta function is just an indicator for whether or not nodes I and J are in the same group. So what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to find the C, like all values of this vector C, and we're trying to find that such that this Q value is as large as possible. And so obviously this is a problem that it's nice we wrote it down, but we still need a way to solve it, so I'm going to tell you about that now. So the most common way to do this is through, I think this algorithm is really beautiful actually, because it's really simple and it gets the job done. And what's nice about it is that the updates at each iteration, so it is an iterative algorithm, the updates are really easy to compute. So this is called the Louvain algorithm, and it's for modularity maximization, which is the Q quality function that I was mentioning before. So how it works is you start with your full network, and then in your first pass, you find groups of things. Like the first pass is the most expensive pass. So you find a few networks that you might want to color the same way. So here we've done like some kind of preliminary scan, and we get red nodes, green nodes, and blue nodes. And then what happens is that all of the nodes in each of these colored groups now become a single node in the graph. And so now, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the light blue ones as well. So now we build a new network between just these four nodes. So all of the networks, all of the nodes that were assigned to each of these course communities now become one node. And then we rebuild a network between all of these communities. And then you just keep doing that until you don't have much change in your quality function. And so we start with this huge network on the left, and then we end up with this tiny network on the right, which is two communities. And looking at the graph, you can actually see there's, I think, two visual communities, because you could kind of cut that right down the middle. And there's a lot of code that will allow you to do this. And I can also direct you to that if you're interested. So there's a lot of community detection methods. Unfortunately, I won't talk about the rest of them right now, but the Louvain algorithm, I think, is one of the most efficient ones to use. So I would highly recommend this as a first pass approach to analyzing your network data. Okay. Oh, I thought I had another slide. Okay. Oops. Okay. So I'm actually going to talk about this before I talk about the slide before it. So another approach for finding communities is the stochastic block model. So this is actually a probabilistic model for communities. Oh, sorry. For a community structure. And so here we're modeling edges essentially as coin flips, but importantly, we're modeling edges based on the endpoints of the nodes. So if you imagine here, we have 4 different communities in this network that we don't know ahead of time. So the process is actually we want to learn the node to community assignments. But what we're also trying to learn is not only the node to community assignments that we're modeling with vector z, but we're trying to learn this probability matrix, which we call pi, which says that which allows us to say the probability of an edge between within and between communities. So for example, on the diagonal in community 1, so the first entry in this matrix, is the probability of edges existing between all nodes in community 1. And the 1, 2 entry would give us the probability of an edge existing between communities 1 and 2. So I've just colored the rows here by the communities that they correspond to over here. And to actually generate a sample from this model, what we do is we just look at this probability, and then it's just a Bernoulli edge probability of having a 1, and if it's a 1, we put an edge and a 0 otherwise. And you can see here that I've colored this probability matrix by the edge probability. So low is blue, medium is yellow, and red is high. And so you can see that that corresponds to the density of these different communities, where the pink one has a lot of edges, but then when you get down to the light green, it's more sparse. And I have an example of this in real life. So this is actually a paper from our group. And what we've done, again, is analyze human microbiome data. And all of the orange matrices represent samples drawn from this probabilistic model that we generated. And so we end up having empirical networks, so of different body sites. So we have like a network from the tongue, the saliva, the plaques, and this is like elbow areas. And then we actually can fit kind of a consensus network model that describes multiple body sites. So for example, in the first column, the orange matrix is supposed to be a sample from the consensus model that should describe the tongue and the saliva. Yeah, so sorry, I think my slides got out of order for some reason, so I apologize for that. Okay, but now I'm going to switch gears to a little bit and talk about link prediction. And so this is the task where if you have a network, what you want to do is infer whether or not there's actually missing links in the network. So for example, you see here on the left, we have our full network, but then on the right, we have some dotted lines between a few pairs of nodes like 5 and 7, 7 and 13, 4 and 12. And so the task in link prediction is actually to automatically be able to guess whether or not there's a link there. So you have all probably dealt with this on a daily basis. So on Facebook, for example, they have a lot of suggestions about people who you may know, which are sometimes like scarily accurate, which is kind of weird. But what they're doing, I mean, they're doing stuff that none of us know unless we work at Facebook, right? But a lot of what they're doing is actually looking at who your friends are, and then they're just guessing, probably based somewhat on community structure and things like this. Is it likely that, you know, person 5 and 7 know each other, given who 5 and 7 are connected to elsewhere? So yeah, I have another, obviously this is what I just said, and this is a really good review article if you're interested. It's called Link Prediction in Social Networks, the State of the Art. And I think this is a really cool field, not just for a social setting, but in a biological example, maybe you'd like to predict whether or not two proteins are likely to interact, and that could help you to design experiments later or something like this. And so there's two main link prediction frameworks. So there's first a similarity-based approach, which is the one I'll talk about. And this diagram is from this review again. And the other approach is from a learning-based approach. So in the similarity approach, what you do is you actually look at different pairs of nodes and you calculate some kind of score which says how likely they are to be connected. But in the learning based approach, you're actually trying to learn what, if there's an edge between a pair of nodes, what are characteristics of their local regions. So if you think about, you could do this with community structure. So one feature that you could have that could influence you in this learning-based approach is if there's a link between two nodes, then they're likely to be in the same community, or they're likely to have like 80% common neighbors or something like this. So I think there's a lot of work that's been done here that have been worked on how to actually find features that will allow you to train a classifier that will allow you to then define positive and negative instances of an edge. Okay, so one really simple thing that you could do with the similarity-based approach is actually just, like I said, calculate a score. So for a pair of nodes, X and Y, you want to calculate some kind of score of how similar they are, and the way that you could do that is counting the number of their common neighbors. So this gamma function is representing just a function that you give it X, and it gives you the neighbors of X. And so you can actually count the number of neighbors that nodes X and Y share, and that will be the similarity score. And then what you do is, once you have the list of all pairwise similarities based on this number of common neighbors, what is typically done is you just take the top X%, or sorry, I shouldn't say X here because X is representing a node, the top P% of links according to the score, and you say that those are the links. And I think that review article will show you that in a lot of cases this works pretty well, but also, like, what is the proportion where you cut off? I think it's a little bit vague, and also maybe sharing common neighbors isn't enough. So obviously further more sophisticated things have been developed. But I think this is kind of reassuring to see that you can do something that's really simple and easy to compute and understand, and still have pretty good accuracy in terms of finding common neighbors, or in terms of predicting whether or not there should be a link. And so a more sophisticated use of neighborhood information is called the Adamic-Adair coefficient. And what this is doing is it's actually weighting similarity between neighbors that two nodes might share heavily if the node that they share is a rare node with less neighbors. So for example, the score is summing over all z such that z is in the intersection of the neighborhoods of x and y. And then we see that the contribution to the score is 1 over the log of the number of neighbors of z. So obviously, if z is like more of a rare node, then that's going to count more because it will have less neighbors. So I think this is a nice approach, because if two nodes are agreeing on a lot of neighbors, and these neighbors are also links with everybody, well, that doesn't really help you, right? Like if everyone's friends with the most popular person in a social network, that doesn't really say anything about the possible relationship between those two people. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have to say about link prediction. Again, I think the applications are pretty standard. Also, you can think about like Amazon. If you buy something, it says, well, people who bought this also bought that, and it's also like very accurate. So you could think about like a product graph between products, and whether or not, so here the nodes would be products, and given that one product was purchased, how likely is it that something else would be as well? Okay, so now I want to switch gears again and talk about the third part of networks that I think is really interesting. So this is the anomaly detection problem. And so I have this cute little picture of fish down here. So we have a bunch of fish. And then obviously there's this red one, and it's kind of standing out from everyone else. So we'd like to do the analog for networks, and we'd like to specifically identify nodes, edges, and substructures that are significantly different from the rest of the network, or from reference networks, or something like this. So an example could be, I showed you at the beginning that temporal network where I had the microbial species interactions at different time points. And then I said, well, the structures at each time point are different. So one example could be in a temporal setting is that given the networks that you've observed before, when is the structure significantly different and what point in time? And so just to set up this problem, what you're typically given is some database of graphs. So this could be plain, so just nodes and edges, or you could also have an attributed network where you have extra information about the nodes or extra information about the edges. And again, it could be static, in which case you have a single network, and you're asking questions about, well, when is how a particular node and how it's connected to the graph weird or something like this, or it could be dynamic, which is the temporal example that I described. And so I mentioned with the exercise is contagious example at the beginning that ego networks are a useful approach. So what this paper referenced here from 2010 has done with their method called oddball is actually use the ego networks of particular nodes. So in this case, we start with our black node, and then we look at the ego network, which is just all the first order neighbors, so all the nodes within one hop of the black node. And then we're going to compare the ego network of a bunch of different nodes and figure out which ego network has like a weirder structure than is typically seen. And what's nice about the ego network is that you can actually easily compute a lot of different kind of features. So we can compute the neighbors of the number of neighbors of ego I, the number of edges in the ego network, and the total weight of the ego network if it's weighted, or the principal eigenvalue of the weighted adjacency matrix of the ego network. So these are all features we can compute on that tiny graph, and then we can compare the ego networks for all of the nodes to each other to figure out what's kind of atypical. And specifically in that paper, they quantified the extent of outlierness. So what they did was they got two measurable ego network properties, X and Y, and then they actually formed an equation to represent the relationship between them. So here you're trying to figure out some C and you raise it to some power. And so this allows you to just model the relationship in the plane between X and Y, and then you can calculate the outlier score like this. So it's nice. So you can actually get an idea of when a network is looking atypical or something like this quantitatively. And just to give you a cool example of this, this is an example about atypical patterns in internet networks. So if you consider source and target nodes, so you have source web pages where you start at, so these are the top bubbles, and then those can go to a bunch of target web pages. So a question might be is like, when is traffic in the network atypical? And so what they did was they actually constructed a network between all of the source nodes, so all of the nodes in the top row, and I think they put an edge between those two things if they shared at least one target. And what you see here is that you have different groups, and they defined anomalous nodes as this network as networks that you could remove that would help separate this into components, meaning that they're networks between highly defined groups, or basically communities here, that are communicating to each other when maybe they shouldn't be. So for example, if you remove nodes 7 and 9, you would turn the network into two components. So these are what they call cut nodes, and also what they refer to as anomalous nodes. So again, we're identifying anomalous nodes as those that cut the network. So you start with a giant connected component, and then if you've taken like a standard algorithms course, you just use a standard max flow min cut algorithm to identify all cut vertices in that component. So there's like standard ways to do this. And you remove those vertices, and now that's broken up the largest component. And again, you find the largest component and then iterate until there's no longer any cut vertices. So I think I really liked this paper. Obviously, I don't do anything with network security, but I liked the whole experimental design, how they started with this bipartite network, or having nodes of two types, and then they did a projection of one type of the nodes, and then basically used structural information to quantify anomalous behavior. Okay, so just to wrap up, so I think we'll have like 5 minutes for questions. So networks are, one, a data structure for relational information. So if you have data objects and a notion about how they interact or measured features about them, then you can represent the information with a network and perform prediction and classification tasks. So obviously, prediction is something like link prediction, and classification here. So community detection is an unsupervised learning method, because we're trying to infer the labels of the nodes, but we don't have like validation of what they are. But I think being able to classify nodes into different groups will help you to distill the structure and learn more about them. So, okay, related to this point, so they also can be a clustering tool. And as I mentioned, they're a clustering analog. So instead of having a point cloud of data, we can use the network. So even if you don't start with a network from the beginning, often you can cast the data as a network. So you can model edges as the pairwise distance or similarity between things. And then just throw stuff away by thresholding and then distill the structure further. And then also as a visualization technique, if done properly, is a point I like to make. So obviously you don't want to just put a paper in, like a figure in a paper that's a huge hairball, but I think that if you can actually look at your data and see that there are highly defined communities or groups, then that will give you hope that there's some kind of structure there that you might want to investigate further. Okay, so thank you guys so much for attending my talk, especially on a Sunday. I hope that you learned something. And again, if you have more networks related questions, please feel free to email me, stanleyn@email.unc.edu, or you can visit my webpage. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. So please feel free to ask questions if you want. Thank you guys so much. What are the most effective tools for network science? Okay, that's a really good question. So I like to use a package called iGraph, and that is in R and it's in Python as well. And it's really easy to use. It's a really well-defined, well-established package. Some people, if you like Python, are also using something called NetworkX. And recently there's been a tool called GraphTool that's developed, which allows you to do more statistical analyses of network data. So, yeah. And for visualization, a lot of people like to use this tool called Gephi, and that's spelled, I'll spell it here. How is iGraph? So Gephi is a visualization. Gephi is a visualization tool. So, and it's really user friendly. So even if you don't know how to program, you could still use it. Okay, so another question: how is iGraph better than NetworkX? I think it's just a personal preference. I don't know. I've always used iGraph, so once I started using that, I never went back. But maybe I should learn NetworkX. Okay, another question. Have you come across network of innovators, people, firm, venture, patenting studies? Yes. Well, I don't know about if you would say innovators, but I know a lot of people look at collaboration networks, and there's work of like the science of science. So how can work be done most effectively, for example? So they'll model networks between researchers. In our group, we have a project going on which is looking at patient and provider networks for cancer care. So they're looking at how doctors work together and how that influences patient outcomes. So yeah, I don't know about this business related stuff, but I assume that you could do something like that. Okay, another question, what language are you using more? So I like to use R and Python, and sometimes MATLAB, but mostly Python and R. Yeah. Where is the future of network analysis? That's a good question. So that's actually a good question. I mean, I'm hopefully graduating in a year, so I'm also trying to figure that out, right? I think that there's a big future in, first of all, making a lot of these graph algorithms scale up to huge network data sets. So, for example, if you consider the Facebook network, this is a huge graph. And so we need to develop tools that can actually scale up and not just work on a graph with 100 nodes. And I also think there's a relationship between machine learning and network science. So figuring out how we can actually get training examples of things like link prediction and anomaly detection so that we can actually learn properties of the graph, which will maybe allow us to not use the whole graph or something like this. And of course, I think that there's a lot of work to be done to integrate network analysis as a standard data analysis technique, and I don't think that it is already, actually. Like, I think people tend to do clustering or regression when they have a data set. So I think that getting this as more of a mainstream practice of data analysis is something in the future. Okay, so you mentioned code for optimization problem. Can you share an open repository? Yes, I can. So if you just Google Jen Louvain, UNC, then you'll find a result that somebody in our group a while ago has developed. And the reference for node influence, sure. I'll send that after the questions are over. So I'll send the link to the code repository and the node influence after the questions are over. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, again, feel free to email me offline. And thank you guys all again for your attention. And I'll make sure to send these two other links to this chat. Thank you so much. Bye.